Ognuno, vanese, gianne, caina, giatti fasina, so fate. No, ognuno, dico che se vuoi andare con scano, ognuno, perché sono da che, in sate, caina, da scove, ina, già, da che no, sa, ma di io, tu ne, sai voi, di dove no, non tu, come da che, di io, ne, già, sa, scove, non tu, come da che.
The Iroquois today is a 20th century man. His house is built of processed siding and asphalt shingles and steel nails. The clothing that he wears is mass-produced in factories. His family is usually small. It is expensive to bring up children nowadays. In the old days, a child grew up knowing all the great stories of his people's past. He learned to sing the songs and dance the ritual dances and take pride in his nation and his race. The parents then could count on everyone to set a good example for his child. Now, well, he does the best he can. Life is different now. Of course, the white man's machinery is very good, but some Iroquois prefer the old ideas. That is why they still make ritual garments and wear them as their fathers did for ceremony and for prayer. They also remember other things. They remember what their fathers said about the earth. The earth is our mother, and we must live like good children in a mother's house. Take only enough for your needs, destroy nothing, and every day give thanks to your Creator. Those Iroquois who still adhere to the old religion are known as the Longhouse people. Their everyday life is much the same as that of any other rural folk. They are farmers, builders, laborers, mechanics. But old and young, they are Indian, and proud of it. The Longhouse people are not numerous anymore. In Canada, 1,200 live near Brantford, and some at other places in Ontario. A few at Caughnawaga in Quebec. The rest in the United States. The other Iroquois, the large majority, are Christians. In spite of religious differences, they live in harmony with one another. The Indian who is Christian, and the Indian who belongs to the Longhouse. The Longhouse was once the symbol of the Iroquois Confederation. Then it came to mean a type of building. Now it is a church. Perhaps to the people it is something more. All the great names are still alive in it. Mohawk, Onondaga, Seneca, Oneida, Cayuga, Tuscarora, all the great nations of the Iroquois. No longer powerful perhaps, but living still. The common people built the Longhouse. They kept it simple and close to nature. Under its roof, and out among the fields, they express in their ceremonies the hopes, fears, and sorrows that are common to all men.
Hero born of woman, hero born of woman. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent.
Welcome to Pioneers of American Socialism.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. punks are running wild in the streets. There's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living room. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I want you to get up right now. Get up, go to your windows, open them, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I know it was to legal.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm as
slave trader, you misogynist rapist, you Holocaust denier, you sadistic marquis, libertine philanderer, you're masochistic sycophant, rub your economic testes, you shitter of the shitter, you compete Stupid traitor, you are the sociopathic satyr. You are just
I wish you was my artist. For starters, who's the largest cat? Get 100 grand for my most garbage rap. Now how hard is that? Everything we spit be hot. Whether it's live on flex or in front of the chick, it's not grind down. We really live what you rhyme about. See me posted up in the tunnel with my shines out. Ice cold like Alaska when I pass it. Got girls shaking, losing their breath as if they catching asthma. Headed to the bar to pop some bottles. Now we in the car, headed home to rock some models. All I hear in the background is Gucci and Prada, but I'm trying to gas these bitches to screw me for nada. We the best that done it, confess you front it. Anybody wanna test, I'ma stretch you want it. And yo, the gangsters back, stop it right where you at. Let a real nigga rock, real murder and rap. Tell them dog niggas listen to that. Got you feeling it hard like you're the gods really bringing it back. I'm from days and legends, it's 8-11, I was the quarter dope.
The 13th, the ceremony of our enfranchisement having been made on the preceding day, I had occasion to ask the German, who was called Pierre Albert, who had accosted us on the day of our arrival, and who was lodging in the cabin of my adopted brother, what he wished me to understand. I prayed him to explain to me what was this alleged happiness which he promised us. Guillaume Potier and Jean Arlott were present. He replied that it would take time to explain to us what he had to say to us, addressing himself to all three, that he thought we ought to join his society, that he would admit us to an establishment, in France, of a republic, for which he had been working for 20 years, that the form of the government should be that of a general society of those composing it, in which, beyond the fact that legality should be perfectly observed, as well as liberty, each would find what he needed, whether for subsistence, or the other needs of life, that each should contribute to the good of the society, as he could. I told him, as did my two comrades, that we were disposed to join him as soon as he should have shown us some security respecting his establishment. The next day we got together again and I began to ask him where he had learned French, which he spoke quite fluently. He told me that, being of a good family, he had been instructed in all that a man ought to know, that after having completed his studies, he had learned English and French, that he spoke these two languages with a little difficulty so far as the pronunciation was concerned, but that he wrote German, Latin, English and French with equal correctness, that for 20 years he had been working to put into execution the plan about which he had talked to us, that 7 or 8 years before he had been obliged to flee from his country, where they wished to arrest him for having desired to put his project into execution, that he had gone over to England, and from there to Carolina, and had also been obliged to depart thence for the same reason, 18 months after having arrived there, that having found among the Cherokees a sure refuge he had been working there for 4 years upon the establishment which he had been planning for 20, that the governor of Carolina having discovered the place of his retreat had sent a commissioner to demand him of the savages there, but that then he was adopted into the nation, and that the savages, rejecting the presence of the English, had refused to give him up, that he had 100 English traders belonging to his society who had just set out for Carolina, whence they were to return the next autumn, after having got together a considerable number of recruits, men and women, of all conditions and occupations, and the things necessary for laying the foundations of his republic, under the name of the Kingdom of Paradise, that then he would buy us from the savages, of whom a large number were already instructed in the form of his republic and determined to join it, that the nation in general urged him to establish himself upon their lands, but that he was determined to locate himself halfway between them and the Alabamans, one where the lands appeared to him of better quality than those of the Cherokees, and there he would be disposed to open a trade with the English and French, that in his republic there would be no superiority, that all should be equal there, that he would take the superintendence of it only for the honor of establishing it, that otherwise his condition would not be different from that of the others, that the lodging, furniture and clothing should be equal and uniform as well as the life, that all goods should be held in common, and that each should work according to his talents for the good of the republic, that the women should live there with the same freedom as the men, that there should be no marriage contract, and that they should be free to change husbands every day, that the children who should be born should belong to the republic, and be cared for and instructed in all things that their genius might be capable of acquiring, that the law of nature should be established for the sole law, and that transgressions should be punished by their contrast, as in the case of the Tiorn. Note: the individual was to have as his only property a chest of books and paper and ink. My comrades and I planned our flight, and agreed together to feign enthusiasm for the execution of the project of Pierre Albert, who had the confidence of the savages, and they left us at liberty with him. I noticed even, on different occasions, that he urged them to live peaceably and to ask peace from the French. Antoine Bonfoy's Journal 1736.
So as you may have guessed by the cold open, we are talking today about early American utopian socialists and their interfacing with indigenous people, both positive and negative aspects of their relationships with indigenous people in the United States. So we are going to first talk about Christian Gottlieb Preiber, who you heard about there from Antoine Bonifay's, I think it was 1750s, somewhere around there, talking about meeting Preiber. He calls him by a different name, but it's definitely Preiber. So we're going to start in the logical place by talking about Preiber, because some consider him the first American utopian, first European American utopian socialist. So we'll talk about him quickly in a minute, but we will also get to talking about the Fourierists and their contact with Native Americans, both in the Wisconsin phalanx, and we'll talk about a little bit in Rochester, New York, as sort of a counterexample, and the Sodus Bay phalanx, Fourierists and the Hicksite Quakers that were involved in that, and how some of them actually supported Seneca's sovereignty. And then speaking of Seneca's sovereignty and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Haudenosaunee peoples, we will conclude by talking about Lewis Henry Morgan and his friendship with Eli Parker. We'll talk about the Civil War, and we'll talk a little bit about Lincoln's Indian policy and some of the controversies, and we'll also clear up some myths about Lincoln's Indian policy as well. So we're going to get to all that, but first things first, we're going to talk about Preiber in Arthur Bester's Backwoods Utopias. This is a great sort of little primer on early American socialism before the Fourier period. He mentions the Fourier period, but really he talks about that in his dissertation, which is called American Phalanxes. But this was the book that he wrote subsequent to that, so we'll talk about, so we'll read from this about what he has to say about Christian Preiber. Thus, for a century and a half, from Plockhoy to Bimmeler, the communitive movement developed in America under exclusively sectarian auspices. That the idea might eventually appeal to non-religious, or at least non-sectarian reformers, was indicated by two enterprises that were projected in the 18th century but failed of realization. The first was sponsored by a well-educated immigrant from Saxony named Christian Preiber, who about 1736 went among the Cherokees in the southern Appalachians, learned their language, protected them from white exploitation, and finally planned a completely communistic society, which he called Paradise. Preiber's plan had its roots in the ideas of Plato and More, not in religious sectarianism. In 1743, Priber, accused by British colonial authorities of aiding the French, was arrested and thrown into prison where he died, his project unrealized. The humanitarian impulse of the Enlightenment did not exhaust itself with Priber. Half a century later, other plans for immigrant colonies were in the air. So let's get into it, and let's get started with Werner W. Crane, A Lost Utopia of the First American Frontier, first published in 1919.
A Lost Utopia of the First American Frontier by Werner W. Crane from the Sewanee Review, January, 1919, Volume 27, Number 1, January, 1919, pages 48 to 61. Early in 1743, the English traders among the Creeks incited the Indians to capture one Priber, a foreigner, who had come into their towns from the mountain country of the Cherokee. For several years past, the authorities in the frontier provinces of South Carolina and Georgia had sought to arrest this individual, who was regarded by them as a most dangerous foe of English interests among the southern Indians, an agent of the French, even, it was darkly hinted, a Jesuit. But in truth, Priber was no ordinary backwoods intriguant, nor yet a Father Raleigh of the southern frontier. Though his career in America makes part of the story of imperial rivalry for the heart of the continent, it belongs as well to the history of the development of social and political ideas in the 18th century. His life was not without stirring incident and physical adventure, but his most memorable adventures were spiritual, idealistic. This phase of the man his provincial captors only dimly understood. At his examination at Frederica in the March colony of Georgia, General Oglethorpe and his frontiersmen found him a very extraordinary kind of a creature, speaking almost all languages fluently, particularly English, Dutch, French, Latin, and Indian. Further, it appeared that he had been scheming to set up a town at the foot of the mountains among the Cherokees, which was to be a city of refuge for all criminals, debtors, and slaves who would fly thither from justice or their masters. The Georgian who wrote this account of Priber's designs, in a letter published in the South Carolina Gazette of August 15, 1743, continued, "There was a book found upon him of his own writing ready for the press, which he owns and glories in. It demonstrates the manner in which the fugitives are to be subsisted, and lays down the rules of government which the town is to be governed by, to which he gives the title of paradise. He enumerates many whimsical privileges and natural rights, as he calls them, which his citizens are to be entitled to, particularly dissolving marriages and allowing community of women, and all kinds of licentiousness. The book is drawn up very methodically, and full of learned quotations. It is extremely wicked, yet has several flights full of invention, and it is a pity so much wit is applied to so bad purposes. Even from so unsympathetic a report it is possible to discover in Priber one of the most singular figures in the history of the first American frontier, a backwoods utopian who, in the 4th decade of the 18th century, imported into the American wilderness the most radical current European social and political philosophy. This very odd kind of man, so James Oglethorpe, soldier and philanthropist, described him, who lived for 7 years among the Cherokee Indians on the headwaters of the Tennessee River, who ate, drank, slept, danced, dressed, and painted himself with the Indians, so that it was not easy, by the testimony of a trader, to distinguish him from the natives, whose only associates, besides the Indians, were captive French voyagers and the hardy Carolinians who sought a commerce in skins and furs with the Cherokee by the mountain trail from distant Charlestown. Was in fact a spiritual descendant of Plato of the Republic, of Sir Thomas More, of Campanella, and a precursor of Rousseau. His city was never built upon the site of ancient Cusawati. His book was apparently never published. Yet from the near-sighted accounts of contemporaries it is possible to reconstruct in some fashion the body of his ideas, and to assign him a place in that stirring of the human spirit which was the 18th century. Few thinkers have found stranger chroniclers of their lives and opinions. There was James Adair, for 40 years a trader among the Cherokee and Chickasaw Indians, whose classic History of the American Indians, a curious medley of frontier history and pseudo-ethnology, was published in London in 1775. There was Ludovic Grant, also for many years an Indian trader from South Carolina, perhaps a truer type of the rude frontiersmen who formed the vanguard of English imperialism in America than the literary and antiquarian Adair. There was Antoine Bonnefoy, engaged to the Voyageurs Chauvin de Joyeuse, whose misfortune it was, in 1741, to be captured, with several companions, by the hostile Cherokee near the mouth of the Ohio, bound with a convoy from New Orleans to the Illinois country. There was also an anonymous Englishman, at one time a resident of Georgia, who had conversed with Priber at Frederica, and who contributed a description of the captive, under the pen name of Americus, to Dodsley's Annual Register O. The year 1760.1 in these accounts, as in several references to the man in the gazettes and in the official records, much was left obscure, even the exact form of his name. To Bonnefoy he was known as Priv Albert, obviously a variant of Priber or Preber, of the English narratives. Once, in a statement of the public debt of South Carolina for 1738 to 1739, when the expense of a party sent up to the Cherokee to arrest him was recorded, his name was paraded in the scholarly dignity of Dr. Priber. There was common agreement, however, that he was a German, specifically a Saxon, and that he was a man of politeness and gentility. From Priber himself Bonnefoy learned that he was of good family, and that he had been instructed in all that a man ought to know, a fact confirmed by Adair, who declared that he was adorned with every qualification that constitutes the gentleman. His politeness, testified Americus, which dress or imprisonment could not disguise, attracted the notice of every gentleman at Frederica, and gained him the favor of many visits and conversations. A strange salon for a philosophe, that barracks prison at the edge of the American wilderness. To his audience it was plain that he had read much, was conversant with most of the arts and sciences, but in all greatly wedded to system and hypothesis. During 2 decades and more before his capture by the English, Priber had been maturing his project for a communistic republic, first in his native country, then, when he was constrained to save his life by exile, in England, and finally, in America. He was but one, and one of the most obscure, of many men of that century of enlightenment who, with him, claimed the title of friends to the natural rights of mankind, enemies to tyranny, usurpation and oppression. His special significance arose from these circumstances, first, that in him converged most of those influences which, appearing more or less sporadically in others, gave to 18th century socialism its chief distinguishing qualities, namely, the cult of antiquity, with its idealization of the classic republics and their lawgivers, love of humanity, in its characteristic form of sensibility, preoccupation with moral ideas and metaphysical abstractions, such as natural rights, often to the exclusion of concrete reality, and not least the doctrine which was to receive its classic statement in the works of Rousseau of the noble savage. And in the second place, whereas his immediate precursors and his contemporaries were writers of poems and romances, merely, like Fenelon, Barras d'Isles, Goudeville, Claude Gilbert, or purely speculative thinkers, like Montesquieu and Darganson, Priber, with the Kerr? Meslier, perhaps alone in his generation, was definitely revolutionary. Less violent in his attack on existing society than the unfortunate Champenois priest, he was more resolute to apply the remedy of complete communism, civil, political, economic. Amid the prevailing detachment, or downright pessimism of the social theorists of that day, his was indeed, as the editor of the Annual Register observed, an uncommon mixture of philosophy and enthusiasm. Unlike most utopians of the century which preceded the French Revolution, he took his utopia seriously, and sought to realize it. He derived from the great utopians, but he pointed forward to Babeuf and to the 19th century. What motives led Priber to choose America, and the Cherokee country in particular, for his experiment in the regeneration of society? An experiment which he hoped to develop later on a larger scale in France. Those to whom he confided his project have thrown no clear light on this point. Adair, Grant, and the Georgians, to be sure, believed that he was primarily a French agent, sent among that powerful and strategically situated tribe to alienate them from the English. But certainly, Bonnefoy and his companions did not recognize him as such, though they perceived that his politics served very well the French interest, and that he encouraged the Indians to preserve their independence. Probably he was actuated rather by his doctrinaire idealism, and by certain circumstances which gave to that portion of the British Empire in America a special prominence at the period of his residence in England. For more than 2 centuries the New World had exercised a magical dominion over the minds of such dreamers as Priber, and had, moreover, profoundly influenced the trend of their ideas toward communistic utopianism. The golden age of pagan antiquity, the terrestrial paradise of the Middle Ages, had been sought with a new zest by men of the 16th century in America. Significantly enough, Sir Thomas More had made the discoverer of Utopia, a companion of Amerigo Vespucci. Montaigne, too, not without a trace of his accustomed irony, had depicted the cannibals as a race falsely assumed to be barbarians, who in reality preserved from a state of nature manners and institutions more perfect than Plato and the philosophers had been able to conceive. Among those who wrote at first hand of the folk that peopled the New World were many who encouraged this enthusiastic interpretation. Most influential in the 17th and 18th centuries were the writings of the Jesuit missionaries. As priests, devoted to a life of poverty and cherishing the social precepts of primitive Christianity, as scholars, versed in the classic tradition of republican virtue, as moralists, not loath to rebuke the vices of contemporary European society, the Jesuits were predisposed to take an optimistic view of the Indians of America, in whom they discovered, despite their savagery, the incarnation of many of their own ideals. From the Jesuit relations emerged the concept of the noble savage, bon savage, which was popularized in France, in England, and elsewhere in Europe by a whole school of poets, romancers, and dramatists. This exotic, utopian literature was made the vehicle, not merely for social satire which exposed the superficial follies of Europeans, by contrast with the simple, unaffected, natural conduct of the savages, but for more or less serious assaults upon the very basis of European society. Equalitarianism which, pushed to its logical conclusion, involved communism was the guise in which the 18th century envisaged the democratic state. The most perfect example of such a state was to be found in America, in Paraguay. There the Jesuits had established among the natives a communist regime which enjoyed a remarkable vogue in contemporary Europe. For a variety of reasons, then, a social theorist like Priber, who aimed to rebuild society upon the foundations of essential human goodness, of natural right, of equality, must have been powerfully drawn to America, where 18th century radical philosophy had found abundant confirmation of its premises. Moreover, shortly before Priber's flight from the continent, There had been displayed in England a striking pageant of the American wilderness, the report of which may well have directed the interest of the philosophical Saxon exile to the country of the Cherokee. In 1730, Sir Alexander Cumming returned from an unofficial mission to the South Carolina frontier, bringing with him 7 Cherokee chiefs, with whom the government, through the Board of Trade, entered into a treaty of friendship and commerce. While in London, the Indians were entertained at all the public diversions of the town, so ran the legend on a contemporary print, and carried to all places of note and curiosity. They were even received by the king at Windsor, where, it was said, the pomp and splendor of the court, and the grandeur, not only of the ceremony as well of the place, struck them with infinite surprise and wonder. On the other hand, the English seem to have been impressed with their strict probity and morality, their easy and courteous behavior. The interest in the southern frontier and its natives which this visit aroused in England was kept alive by the proposal of a new March colony between the Savannah and Altamaha rivers, a project which led in 1733 to the establishment of the province of Georgia. In that year or shortly after, Priber emigrated to South Carolina. Of his brief career as a provincial, almost nothing has been recorded. By a strange coincidence, another sojourner in Charlestown during that time was a Swiss engineer, employed upon the sea defenses of the colonial capital, one Gabriel Bernard, who was named affectionately by his nephew Jean-Jacques in the most famous of all autobiographies. Although by Bonnefoy's account Priber was forced to leave Carolina for the same reason that he had been compelled to flee from his native country, i.e., the opposition of the authorities to his subversive program, his departure was apparently not made in haste. In 3 separate issues of the weekly South Carolina Gazette in December 1735, there were advertised, to be sold by Mr. Priber near Mr. Lawrence the Saddler, ready-made men's clothes, wigs, spatterdashes of fine holland, shoes, boots, guns, pistols, powder, a silver repeating watch, a sword with a silver gilt hilt, English seeds, beds, and a fine chest of drawers very reasonable for ready money, he intending to stay but a few weeks in this town. From his store of genteel possessions, he retained only paper and ink and a trunk filled with books. Having divested himself thus of the trappings of civilization, armed only with the weapons of the philosopher, Priber set forth on his extraordinary mission to the Indians of the southern Appalachians. On the mid-course of the Tellico River, where that stream, which takes its rise high up on the western slope of the Unaka Mountains, suddenly debouches into Tellico Plains 15 miles from its confluence with the Little Tennessee, not quite 30 miles from the junction of the latter with the Tennessee River, there stood Great Tellico, chief of the towns of the Overhill Cherokee. Its importance was due to its location on one of the branches of the Tennessee River, the route of the Cherokee in their raids upon the French and their Indians on the Ohio and the Mississippi, to its exposed position, by reason of which it bore the brunt of enemy attacks, and to the fact that at the time the acknowledged leader among the headmen of the Cherokee, whom Sir Alexander Cumming had designated, grandiloquently, as emperor of the nation, was Moytoy of Tellico. It was this village, distant from Charlestown more than 500 miles by trading path, which Priber selected as the principal scene of his labors. The immediate success of Priber in soliciting the confidence of the Indians won the admiration and the envy of the English traders who observed him. Being a great scholar, he soon made himself master of their tongue, and by his insinuating manner endeavored to gain their hearts. He trimmed his hair in the Indian manner and painted as they did, going generally almost naked except a shirt and a flap. In the view of Ludovic Grant, a principal trader at Tellico, and of his associates in the trade, these tactics alone must have convicted Priber of being a French agent. Certainly, they were far removed from the ordinary methods of the English traders, who were constantly accused, by the English themselves, of contempt for the Indians, of dishonesty in their dealings with them, often of gross brutality. That the English were in general the successful rivals of the French was due, not to their diplomacy, which was distinctly inferior, but to the cheapness and sufficiency of their trade. The considerable influence which Priber won by adapting himself to the habits of the Indians he used to protect them from exploitation by the traders, to promote their independence and their advancement in the knowledge of useful arts and in organization, to turn them from war to the pursuits of peace, and to spread his propaganda of a communistic state. By these policies Priber came into collision with certain of the traders and eventually with the South Carolina government. When he taught the Indians the use of weights and measures, and constructed for them steelyards, he probably accomplished more to protect them from cheating traders and pack horsemen than had been accomplished in 30 years by a succession of assiduous but overburdened Indian agents. But he was not content simply to make them more acute in their dealings with the whites. He sought to establish their independence, and their equality with all their neighbors, of whatever race or nationality. Adair, who did not grasp the exact nature of Priber's design, although he realized something of its scope, wrote that he inflated the artless savages, with a prodigious high opinion of their own importance in the American scale of power, on account of the situation of their country, their martial disposition, and the great number of their warriors, which would baffle all the efforts of the ambitious and ill-designing British colonists. Americus was probably more accurate in ascribing to him the aim of engaging the Indians, to throw off the yoke of their European allies of all nations. Both the English and the French he taught them to regard as interlopers and the invaders of their own rights. Believe me, he predicted after his capture, before this century is past, the Europeans will have a very small footing on this continent. Nevertheless, it was the English whose interests were immediately imperiled, and certain of Priber's acts gave color to the belief that he was in the French service. Despite occasional efforts of the French in Louisiana to open relations with the Cherokee, the English of Carolina had enjoyed a practical monopoly of their trade. Priber argued that an effective means to preserve their liberties would be by opening a water communication between them and New Orleans. For the future, he advised they should trade with both upon the same footing, which would be their greatest security, for they would then be courted and caressed and receive presents from both. Again, he exerted himself to dissuade the Indians from warlike enterprises. The longtime enemies of the Overhill Cherokee were the French and their Indian allies of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. When raids were incited by the English traders, Priber worked, in concert with French prisoners like Bonnefoy, to frustrate them. To a remarkable degree, the Indians appear to have entered into his spirit of pacification. In all his counsel, Priber professed to be seeking only the interest of the Indians, the noble savages, of the generous tradition to which he subscribed. Most of all, Grant declared, Priber inculcated into the minds of the Indians a great care and jealousy for their lands, and that they should keep the English at a distance from them. To this establishment Priber assured Bonnefoy and his companions that he had won many adherents among the English traders, a class perpetually in debt to the Charlestown merchants, and among the Indians, whose own institutions were not in principle opposed to those he advocated. Ludovic Grant, who held in virtuous scorn Priber's visionary ideas, observed that he proposed to them a new system or plan of government, that all things should be in common amongst them, that even their wives should be so, and that the children should be looked upon as the children of the public and be taken care of as such and not by their natural parents, that they should move the chief seat of government to a place nearer the French called Coosawattee, where in ancient times a town had stood, belonging to the Cherokees, and that they should admit into their society Creeks and Catawbas, French and English, all colors and complexions, in short all who were of these principles, which, the trader piously concluded, were truly such as had no principles at all. The form of the Republic, as Priber expounded it to the French captives, was to be a Société Générale, in which the two fundamental principles of liberty and equality should be perfectly observed. In his emphasis upon equality, Priber reflected the strongest positive tendency in the social thinking of his century. To observers as diverse as Darganson and Meslier, the great evil of existing society appeared to be the disparity between men in point of rank and condition. Even Montesquieu held that equality was the ideal of the Republic, an ideal to be attained, however, only in the small state. In harmony with his school, Priber conceived of equality as not only civil and political, but also, and necessarily, economic. In the Kingdom of Paradise, private property was not to exist even in the mitigated form of small holdings, advocated for republics by Montesquieu. All goods should there be held in common. Thus equality, in Priber's theory, meant communism. It also meant uniformity, even in such details as the houses and furniture of the citizens. Among the latter there was to be no adventitious superiority, of any sort. The author of the ideal commonwealth, himself, would undertake its direction solely for the honor involved. In stressing the principle of liberty, however, Priber sounded a note not always heard in Utopia. Darganson, on the contrary, had praised the benevolent despotism as the form of government best designed to ensure equality among the subjects. One of the most popular of the literary utopias of that period, the Histoire de Sévérams of Verres d'Alais, 1677, had described a complete tyranny, exercised for the common good. In contrast to the minute regulations imposed by Severias, the Kingdom of Paradise was to have as its sole law the law of nature. Moreover, the liberty which was allowed to men should be shared equally by women, in sign of which no marriages should be contracted. The children of the temporary unions were to be reared by the state, and instructed in everything which they were capable of learning. Priber clearly had in view a society in which every talent should have unhampered opportunity for development, and where each citizen should work according to his abilities for the good of the Republic. The axiom of the Saint Simonists, to each according to his needs, from each according to his capacity, was anticipated by Priber. Chacun y trouverot son en, c'est certain pour la subsistance que pour les autres besoins de la vie, que chacun aussi contribuera au bien de la société, de si dont il sera capable. In the history of utopias, Priber's project occupies an undefined middle ground between the purely literary utopia, on the one hand of the class of More's prototypal work, of Campanella's City of the Sun, of a whole literature in the drama and the romance which flourished in Priber's own time, and on the other, the applied utopianism of the Anabaptists of the Reformation period, of the Fourierists and the Owenites. The book which would have given him place among the authors of ideal commonwealths was in manuscript when he was carried captive to Frederica, and probably perished with him, as also his dictionary of the Cherokee language, which would have established his name among the first students of American linguistics. From the glimpses of his ideas which uncultured frontiersmen were able to catch, it is clear that there has been lost, if not one of the great utopias, at least one most significant of his century. The catalogue of characteristics which M. Joly has ascribed to 18th century socialism fits, with little amendment, the social philosophy of Priber. Republic, vertu, bonheur, innocence, égalité, communauté, courage et pauvreté. Lycurg. Et l'âge d'or, et les bons sauvages, et le christianisme sentimental, et la simple nature, et les j, sweets du Paraguay, tout c'est la ferme and fiso indissoluble. The possibility of establishing a new social order upon a basis essentially moral and metaphysical rather than scientific was never tested, as Priber had planned, in the Kingdom of Paradise of Kusawati. It was his misfortune that his design ran right athwart the imperial purposes of the English in America. Hardly had he begun to spread his propaganda among the neighbors of the Cherokee, than the commander at Fort Augusta on the Main perceived a remarkable intractability in the Creek Indians in matters of trade. After inquiries, he traced the responsibility to a white man who had resided some time in the upper towns, after having been many years among the Cherokees, who always shewed him the utmost deference. On instructions from Captain Kent, the English traders secured the arrest of Priber, who was on his way, as they believed, to the French at Mobile, and sent him down, with his bundle of manuscripts, to Frederica. Thereupon the Indians made it very apparent by their clamors that they were not a little interested in his safety. The treatment accorded him in Georgia was that of a political prisoner of rank and importance. He was confined in the barracks and guarded by a sentry night and day. In the ruin of his hopes he continued to maintain an imperturbable front. It is folly, he would say, to repine at one's lot in life. My mind soars above misfortune. In this cell I can enjoy more real happiness than it is possible to do in the busy scenes of life. Reflections upon past events, digesting former studies, keep me fully employed, whilst health and abundant spirits allow me no anxious, no uneasy moments. I suffer, though a friend to the natural rights of mankind, though an enemy to tyranny, usurpation, and oppression. And what is more, I can forgive and pray for those that injure me. After a few years of imprisonment, Priber died. The verdict upon his career has followed too closely the opinion of his enemy, Ludovic Grant. Thus ended the famous Priber. A most notorious rogue and iniquitous fellow who, if he had been permitted to have lived much longer in that country, would undoubtedly have drawn that nation over to the French interest. More generous in his judgment was Adair, who likewise regarded Priber as a menace to English dominion in Southern America, but who nevertheless affirmed that he deserved a much better fate. He deserved, no doubt, a better fate than the oblivion which has befallen him. Philosopher, utopian, linguist, scholar, friend of peace, of progress, of the Indian, his was a solitary figure among the ruder folk who peopled the outer fringe of European civilization in America. Chimerical his enterprise must seem. By reason of it, however, the first American frontier became, for a few years, the first frontier of 18th century social idealism. Verner W. Crane, University of Michigan.
So very interesting to look at how utopians of the 18th century looked at indigenous peoples like the Cherokee, but into the 19th century, as the United States was expanding and sort of manifest destiny, this frontier idea became sort of the dominant ideology. Sometimes people sort of had these sort of Whiggish notions of progress that were maybe, by the 19th century, maybe a little bit old-fashioned, although, you know, the nation was still young. But sometimes that contradicted other ways of living, and so you know, as I'm going to demonstrate in a moment, sometimes the utopian ideology of the early socialists had elements of settler colonialism that conflicted, but also sort of made them into sort of contradictory figures who kind of both challenged manifest destiny and the ideology and presented a counter hegemonic answer to that, but also you know, in some ways also reinforced and provided the government justification for Indian removal. So we'll talk about the Wisconsin phalanx in that context. So I'm going to have a section from the chapter on the Wisconsin phalanx from Amy Hart's book, Fourier's Communities of Reforms, The Social Networks of 19th Century Female Reformers. I was lucky enough to be able to review this book for an up-and-coming communal societies journal, so This is an excellent look at how in this case Fourierism, but you can extrapolate it more broadly into early American socialism in general, was sort of at the nexus of all the different reform movements of the time, including abolitionism and things as well. And as we'll talk about too, even calls from white people to have more sovereignty for Native nations. But this is from chapter 4 of that book, Contested Community, the Wisconsin Phalanx and the Western Frontier, from Amy Hart.
Throughout the 1840s, covered wagons carried families and speculators across the United States, moving them westward toward rural landscapes they embraced as their new homes. By the end of the decade, the United States government claimed territory reaching to the Pacific Ocean, and waves of wealth-seeking Americans and immigrants were traveling from the East Coast in eager pursuit of gold. But in the early 1840s, the Far West, for American settlers, still referred to Wisconsin and its surrounding territories. These lands, occupied by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, were gradually claimed by the federal government and white settlers over the course of the 19th century. One such group that sought a better life in the rural territory was the assembly of farmers and Fourierists who formed the Wisconsin Phalanx. The Wisconsin Phalanx represents a community formed on the frontier. Led by farmers seeking affordable land in the Western territories. The community's reliance on farming as the primary economic activity of the group differentiated Wisconsin Phalanx from many other Fourierist communities, most of which pursued a variety of artisanal and industrial activities alongside agricultural endeavors. Wisconsin Phalanx was also much more isolated from urban centers than the other Fourierist communities. As a result, community members relied on agricultural production for both sustenance and profit in frontier markets, as opposed to other Fourierist communities that could sell manufactured products and offer services to nearby urban markets. The community members' identities as farmers on the western frontier, as well as their isolated beginnings in territorial Wisconsin, made this community unique in its respective approaches to labor, to neighboring indigenous populations, and to the emerging state government. Specifically, Wisconsin Phalanx members elevated agricultural production over all other economic pursuits, participated in the diminishing of indigenous population levels, and introduced social and political reforms that shaped Wisconsin's transition to statehood. These elements of the community, and their impacts on the future lives of community members, are the focus of this chapter. The elements of the Wisconsin Phalanx that made the community distinct from other Fourierist communities also led to the community's conflicting application of social reforms. First, Wisconsin Phalanx members' efforts to reduce economic inequality ironically resulted in the displacement of indigenous communities and the elimination of their economic means of existence. Fourierists attempted to introduce a new economic system through cooperative organization that would counter the inequality produced by unchecked market capitalism. Nevertheless, they did not anticipate the consequences of introducing their agriculture-based economic system on the indigenous peoples of the region. As farmers, Wisconsin Phalanx community members were motivated by the acquisition of affordable lands. They were thus contributors to the nation-building project of 19th-century United States and its expansionist goals, even if they stated their opposition to the economic element of that project. As will be discussed below, former members of Wisconsin Phalanx later went on to become educators at boarding schools intended to civilize indigenous communities, further participating in the erasure of indigenous cultures and languages through assimilation. Their complex relationships with non-white populations were further complicated by the anti-slavery sentiments of Wisconsin Phalanx members, possibly even extending into participation in the Wisconsin network of the Underground Railroad. Wisconsin phalanx members thus protested and resisted some policies endorsed by the United States government, namely, the spread of market capitalism and the institution of slavery, while simultaneously furthering other policies supported by the federal government, namely, the removal of indigenous peoples and their assimilation through civilizing efforts. In the 1820s, years before Fourierists arrived to establish their community in Wisconsin, the federal government considered the Wisconsin region so isolated from the rest of the United States that the area was declared an ideal reservation for indigenous peoples who had been removed from the eastern states. In the early 1830s, before Wisconsin was given territorial status, its population consisted of diverse indigenous communities and a few thousand French and Métis fur traders. By the time Wisconsin became a United States territory in 1836, white settler colonists were streaming into southern Wisconsin from the East Coast, looking for land and financial opportunities in the area's lead mines. Indigenous peoples were simultaneously removed from Wisconsin through treaties negotiated by federal agents, while also being exposed to civilizing efforts introduced by missionary-led boarding schools. Regardless of treaties that legally reduced or eliminated their claim to their lands, some indigenous tribes, most notably Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Lac du Flambeau Chippewa communities, chose to remain in central Wisconsin and attempted to adjust to the changing landscapes and economies. The removal process is initiated by federal treaties, and the cultural disruption initiated by boarding schools were ongoing during the period when the Wisconsin Phalanx was founded. Fourierists arrived in Wisconsin in 1844, just 2 years before the territorial government applied for Wisconsin statehood. The community was founded primarily by reform-minded farmers who were inspired by Charles Fourier's writings to pursue a cooperative approach to farming in the Wisconsin Territory. This group of Fourierist curiosos was founded in Southport, Wisconsin, but many of its members had initially immigrated from the East Coast, moving increasingly westward as they sought affordable lands for farming. Their political and social sympathies thus aligned with many other former Northeasterners who had migrated westward over the preceding decades, namely, through their advocacy for the Free Soil movement, the political movement opposing the introduction of slavery into the Western territories in favor of allowing only free laborers. Most Wisconsin Phalanx members were initially Democrats and anti-slavery Whigs, though their commitment to free soil and free labor would eventually transition into membership in the emerging Free Soil and Republican political parties. The ideal of creating a country populated by free, property-owning citizens motivated settler expansion into Western territories, including among budding Fourierists. The Wisconsin Phalanx thus provides a unique example of the sometimes overlapping goals of mid-century pioneer farmers and Fourierist reformers through their shared advocacy of the free soil movement and colonial settlement of indigenous peoples' lands. Few Wisconsin Fourierists discussed the presence of indigenous populations on the lands they were settling. Warren Chase, co-founder of the Wisconsin Phalanx, recognized the power of the federal government to oust indigenous communities in favor of white American settlers when he stated in his autobiography, Uncle Sam, being himself the highest tribunal of authority in this world, could not have his title tried. Nevertheless, when he and his fellow Fourierists founded the Wisconsin Phalanx, they failed to mention their indirect role in ousting the remaining indigenous populations through the introduction of disease and alterations to the local natural resources. Other white settlers' accounts from the period mention dwindling indigenous populations in the area due to outbreaks of smallpox and cholera. Louisa Sheldon, a member of the Wisconsin Phalanx, discussed the rapid decline of the local Menominee population in one of the rare recognitions by a Fourierist of the presence of indigenous communities. In a letter to her sister written in 1848, Sheldon writes, "There was some ague and fever here last fall, but is quite healthy now except among the Indians. They are dying very fast. I heard that when one takes ague, they kill and bury them." The Menominee tribes are nearly all dead. The chief says they only last 2 moons longer. Sheldon describes the indigenous population decline as a passive observer, with no mention of her role in exacerbating the spread of disease in the area by increasing the population of potential disease carriers. Mounting pressure from white settler colonists led the federal government to pressure the Menominee tribe into a treaty mandating the sale of their lands and their relocation to Minnesota in 1848, though following violent protests by Menominees, a subsequent 1854 treaty allowed them to regain reservation land in Wisconsin. These disputes occurred while Wisconsin Phalanx members were present, and they may have even played a role in pressuring the federal government to make more land available to white farmers. According to the federal census, only 139 non-Indigenous individuals lived in Fond du Lac County in 1840. Thus the arrival of these Fourierist families 4 years later represented a significant portion of the increase in white settlers moving to the region. Even if they did not directly demand Indigenous removal, Fourierists inevitably added to mounting pressure on the federal government to not only civilize, but also to remove remaining Indigenous communities. The Wisconsin Phalanx members represent a group that both challenged American social and economic norms while also furthering American settler colonial goals. By acting on favorable government treaties that diminished or eliminated the recognized territory of the Potawatomis, Chippewas, Menominees, Ottawas, and Ho-Chunk, white settlers were able to stream into Wisconsin and claim the territory for themselves. Wisconsin Fourierists followed a similar pattern. After finding and laying claim to land in Fond du Lac County in the spring of 1844, the pioneer group of the Wisconsin Phalanx immediately began constructing dormitories and clearing the land, turning the prairie into wheat fields. By July of that year, most of the founders' wives and children had followed the pioneer group to the territory, initiating their experiment with communal living.
American Socialism travels on location.
Today with Friends of Mount Hope. Today I'm at the mausoleum of Lewis Henry Morgan and the Morgan family. This is Lewis Henry Morgan. He's considered a father of modern anthropological theory. He contributed ethnographic and ethnological methods, kinship studies, unilinear model of social evolution, and many other things to the field of anthropology and also to social theory. He's one of the only American social theorists to be quoted or to be cited by 3 major social theorists of the 19th century, Marx, Darwin, and Freud. He was born near Cayuga Lake in the Finger Lakes in 1818. He graduated from Union College in 1840. In 1842, he was admitted to the Rochester Bar Association, and he worked as a railroad lawyer and entrepreneur for most of his life, in addition to his studies as a scholar. In the 1840s, he formed a secret society known as the Gordian Knot, later became known as the Grand Order of the Iroquois, and finally the New Confederacy of the Iroquois. It was a romantic literary club that practiced a combination of Iroquois rites and Masonic rituals. He befriended a Seneca named Hassa Neanda when he was a teenager. His English name was Eli Parker, and he joined the New Confederacy along with Morgan. The New Confederacy actually helped him to become a successful civil engineer, and he was appointed as a civil engineer with the Grant administration. In 1838, the Ogden Land Company defrauded the Seneca Nation out of their remaining land. Morgan and the New Confederacy of the Iroquois mobilized support for the Seneca and lobbied the government to allow them to buy back some of their land, which is what created what's today the Tonawanda Reservation. Morgan was adopted into the Hawk clan of the Seneca Nation and given the name Tayadawaka, which means bridging the gap, because he bridged the gap between whites and indigenous people. In 1851, he wrote the first of a series of books on the culture and customs of the Iroquois, which was called the League of the Iroquois. And he became one of the founders of the University of Rochester in 1852. He was elected to the New York Assembly in 1861, and he served in the state senate from 1868 to 1869. So he served under both the Lincoln and the Grant administrations. He was seeking an appointment to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which he never got. Morgan, he formed the Morgan Iron Company in 1863 and became wealthy from the Civil War. Morgan believed in capitalism, but he opposed monopolies as an assemblyman, especially monopolies in the railroad. Morgan died in 1881. This mausoleum, the building was started in 1862 when his two daughters died tragically at the ages of 6 and 2. You see on the right here it says non hic sumus, which means we are not here in Latin. So the two girls are not here, but today Louis, his wife Mary, and their son Lemuel rest here. The building, as I said, was completed in 1881. Louis Henry Morgan died the same year. Today is Juneteenth, so I wanted to say a word about Morgan's views towards slavery. He did oppose slavery. He was a Republican politician from the North. However, he did not believe that the federal government had authority to end slavery because it was in the Constitution. However, he did help the Civil War effort. His steel company, helped the Union win the Civil War. And I mentioned that he sought a appointment to the Bureau of Indian Affairs under both Lincoln and Grant. Lincoln and Grant, as much as they made progress for civil rights with emancipation and Reconstruction, one of the dark spots in both of their legacies was their treatment towards Native peoples, and some of the worst massacres of Natives in American history happened under their administrations. So I like to think that if Grant or Lincoln had appointed Morgan to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, things may have been better for Indigenous people under their administrations.
So communists often hear the objection that communism can never work because it's against humanity's essentially greedy, selfish human nature. But is human nature really essentially greedy? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels argued that human nature evolved along a dialectical trajectory based on conflict over material resources. In light of this view, their bold proclamation in the 1848 Communist Manifesto that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle begs the question, what came before class struggle, before hitherto existing society? In the manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels sketched out a path of social evolution that continues to influence historical materialists today. They wrote, "In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones." So they described historical epochs, ancient, feudal, and bourgeois, characterized by the complex relationships of oppressors to oppressed. However, it would not be until Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, published in 1884, that Engels attempted to explain what came before hitherto existing society, before the history of class struggle. Engels wrote The Origin of the Family using Marx's notes for a book that Marx had planned to write about the work of anthropologist Louis Henry Morgan from my hometown of Rochester, around the time of Marx's death in 1883. Engels described the pre-society, pre-class struggle period as primitive communism. Today, the less Eurocentric term primary communism is maybe more appropriate. According to anthropologists, this period is made up over 99% of human history. What can this history before society, before class struggle, teach us about human nature and the potential for revolutionary transformation of society today? Pioneer anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan was the first to identify the political economy of the extensive pre-class period as primitive communism. Morgan was a profound influence on Marx and Engels' anthropological thought. Engels praised Morgan in the preface to the first edition of his book, The Origin of the Family, in 1884. For Morgan, in his own way, had discovered afresh in America the materialist conception of history discovered by Marx 40 years ago, and in his comparison of barbarism and civilization, it had led him in the main points to the same conclusions as Marx. And just as the professional economists in Germany were for years as busy in plagiarizing capital as they were persistent in attempting to kill it by silence, so Morgan's ancient society received precisely the same treatment from the spokesman of prehistoric science in England. Much later, socialists such as Sam Marcy, founder of the Communist Workers' World Party, would use the less pejorative term primary communism. Marcy wrote in 1992, Lewis Henry Morgan's writings on the communal life of the Iroquois in North America confirmed what the socialist movement in Europe had deduced about early societies elsewhere before written history. There was a universal period when property was communal. There was no state, and the products of human labor were shared equitably. In 1851, Morgan published the League of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, which became a founding text of ethnography, the scientific study of cultural customs. Morgan discovered that the Haudenosaunee had practiced communism in living for centuries. Haudenosaunee society planned for and met the needs of each individual. Extended families lived communally in large longhouses and shared their belongings in common. They organized intercommunal trade networks based on reciprocity. In 1881, Morgan wrote, "Among the Iroquois, hospitality was an established usage. If a man entered an Indian house in any of their villages, whether a villager, a tribesman, or a stranger, it was the duty of the women therein to set food before him. An omission to do this would have been a discourtesy amounting to an affront. If hungry, he ate. If not hungry, courtesy required that he should taste the food and thank the giver. This would be repeated at every house he entered and at whatever hour of the day." Hospitality and harmony were key values in Haudenosaunee society. Engels explained the conditions that made primary communism possible. A division of the tribe or gens into different classes was equally impossible, and that brings us to the examination of the economic basis of these conditions. The population is extremely sparse. It is dense only at the tribe's place of settlement, around which lie, in a wide circle, first the hunting grounds and then the protective belt of neutral forest which separates the tribe from others. The division of labor is purely primitive between sexes only. The man fights in the wars, goes hunting and fishing, procures the raw materials of food and the tools necessary for doing so. The woman looks after the house and the preparation of food and clothing, cooks, weaves, sews. They are each master in their own sphere, the man in the forest, the woman in the house. Each is owner of the instruments which he or she makes and uses, the man of the weapons, the hunting and fishing implements, the woman of the household gear. The housekeeping is communal among several and often many families. What is made and used in common is common property, the house, the garden, the longboat. Key to Engels' interpretation of Morgan was Morgan's discovery of matrilineal society, where the family lineage is traced through the female line. Marcy explained, primary communism based on food gathering and hunting succumbed to private ownership because it lacked the necessary concentration and development of the means of production. But private property, while more productive, also brought subjugation and degradation, first of women. The overthrow of matrilineal society signaled the beginning of inequality in class society, according to Engels. And Engels said, the overthrow of mother right was the world historic defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. This degraded position of the woman, especially conspicuous among the Greeks of the heroic and still more of the classical age, has gradually been palliated and glossed over, and sometimes clothed in a milder form. In no sense has it been abolished. Engels saw Morgan's discovery so key to understanding the origins of inequality that he wrote in the preface to the 1884 fourth edition of Origin of the Family. This rediscovery of the primitive matriarchal gens as the earlier stage of the patriarchal gens of civilized people has the same importance for anthropology as Darwin's theory of evolution has for biology, and Marx's theory of surplus value for political economy. It enabled Morgan to outline for the first time a history of the family in which, for the present, so far as the material now available permits, at least the classic stages of development in their main outlines are now determined. That this opens a new epoch in the treatment of primitive history must be clear to everyone. The matriarchal gems has become the pivot on which the whole science turns. Since its discovery, we know where to look and what to look for in our research and how to arrange the results. And consequently, since Morgan's book, progress in this field has been made at a far more rapid speed. So Engels considered Morgan's work as groundbreaking as Darwin's or Marx. Indeed, many of Engels' conclusions in The Origin of the Family were as influenced by Darwin's theories as they were by Morgan's. When Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species was first published in 1859, it caused a sensation in the academic world. Scientists, biologists, and philosophers interpreted Darwin's evolutionary model in different ways. Social Darwinism was a belief that the strong survive through natural selection, and that this idea should be applied to humankind as much as Darwin applied it to the rest of nature. Social Darwinism came to dominate North American social theory in the 1870s. Social Darwinism really had little to do with Darwin. In fact, conservative Anglican Thomas Robert Malthus's essays on population established the idea that on the whole the best live, an idea which influenced Darwin's concept of natural selection. It was social Darwinist theorist Herbert Spencer that actually coined this term survival of the fittest. Social Darwinists argued that society was rightly dominated by the powerful because they were the best of society. They argued that competition was the rule of success, not cooperation. Social Darwinism had been used to justify eugenics, imperialism, capitalism, and eventually fascism. However, others combined Darwin's theory of evolution with other kinds of evidence from zoology and anthropology and derived very different conclusions. Russian anarchist, zoologist, and theorist Peter Kropotkin argued in 1902 that mutual aid, reciprocal exchange for mutual benefit, not competition and violence, were a key factor for evolutionary success. Kropotkin wrote, "As soon as we study animals not in laboratories and museums only, but in the forest and the prairie, in the steppe and the mountains, we at once perceive that though there is an immense amount of warfare and extermination going on amidst various species, and especially amidst various classes of animals, there is at the same time as much or perhaps even more of mutual support, mutual aid, and mutual defense amidst animals belonging to the same species, or at least to the same society." Kropotkin listed many examples of intra- and inter-species mutual aid in the animal world and concluded the animal species in which individual struggle has been reduced to its narrowest limits and the practice of mutual aid has attained the greatest development are invariably the most numerous, the most prosperous, and the most open to further progress. He cited a study done by Russian zoologist Karl Kessler, who concluded that all classes of animals, especially the higher ones, practice mutual aid, using empirical evidence collected from burying beetles, birds, and mammalia. Humans were no exception. Kropotkin concluded, "It is evident that it would be quite contrary to all that we know of nature if men were an exception to so general a rule. If a creature so defenseless as man was at his beginning should have found his protection and his way to progress not in mutual support like other animals, but in reckless competition for personal advantages with no regard to the interests of the species. Although leader of the Russian Revolution Vladimir Lenin and Kropotkin disagreed on tactics, the two agreed that communism was the right course for humankind. Kropotkin said upon meeting Lenin, "How glad I am to see you, Vladimir Ilyich. You and I have different views. We have different points of view about a whole series of problems, but as far as the execution and organization is concerned, but our goals are the same, and what you and your comrades are doing in the name of communism pleases me very much and makes my already aging heart happy." Lenin was so impressed by Kropotkin's work that he approved a state funeral in Moscow for Kropotkin in 1921 and allowed anarchists to march and carry anti-Bolshevik banners. Recent research has proven Kropotkin's statement to be true of the earliest human ancestors.
In 1850, Lewis Henry Morgan resurfaced to steer Parker's course. Morgan needed help with his Haudenosaunee studies, and he found his friend a new career as an engineer on the Erie Canal. That job brought Ely to Rochester, New York, Morgan's home and a 19th century boomtown.
This is a place with mills and factories and steamboats and the canals. He's not really that far away geographically from the reservation, but he's far away culturally.
Rochester was home to Frederick Douglass and the abolitionist movement, to Susan B. Anthony and the campaign for women's rights. Ely thrived in that setting. And in 1851, he earned a place among Rochester's notables with the publication of Lewis Henry Morgan's League of the Haudenosaunee. The exhaustive study of Six Nations culture earned Morgan acclaim as a founder of American anthropology. Ely shared some of the credit. Morgan dedicated the book to Hasanoanda and acknowledged it was the fruit of their joint researches. But a higher honor soon followed. In the fall of 1851, at the age of 23, Ely was made one of the 50 sachems of the Six Nations. The Grand Council presented him with the silver medal given to the Seneca Red Jacket by George Washington in 1792. Then, he was given the name Tonehongowa and the title of chief. But his duties were as a servant, to honor his ancestors, his people, and the 7 generations to come.
And our job in the middle is to bridge that gap.
U.S. military forces were overwhelmed. By 1868, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs estimated that the wars cost the government $1 million per Indian killed. A federal delegation was sent to talk potential solutions with Western Indian nations, and Ely was asked to lend his expertise. He concluded that the entire Indian affairs system was flawed by lack of judgment and inefficiencies. In 1869, Ulysses S. Grant became president, and one of his first acts was to appoint Ely Parker Commissioner of Indian Affairs.
No Native American had ever held that position before. It was brand new, but it was well received. The Senate, without hesitation, confirmed it.
As a Commissioner of Indian Affairs, first of all, he continued the program he had laid out to Grant and to Lincoln at the Army headquarters at City Point in 1864 and 5. First of all, peace policy. A policy of moving from military extermination of Native peoples to establishing peace with them.
I believe his politics are right, that if you fulfill your promises to Indians, you deliver the treaty goods, you deliver the food, you deliver the services you promised, you won't have a war with Indians. A lot of people don't realize that that's what it was about back then.
His idea was, let's put these people on reservations. They're in a controlled space. But it's important not only to put them in that controlled space, but let's educate them. Let's teach them the things that they need to know in order to survive and move forward into the next century.
He says we have to humanize, civilize, and Christianize the Indians. And that was no different than what everybody else was saying at the time. And I believe that's where the seduction took place, that he really believed that tradition would no longer save the Indians from their fate, because their fate was now being determined by those who were humanized, civilized, and Christianized.
PBS documentary about Ely Parker, who was Lewis Henry Morgan's Haudenosaunee friend, who he helped actually he eventually became friends with Grant, joined the Civil War, became part of Grant's inner circle, and very interesting figure in history. But his tenure as the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was another one of those things, where it was a complicated, sometimes contradictory endeavor, and he actually never did go back to the reservation and sort of fully integrated into the white world, and then actually ended up sending in troops and things to put down rebellions in Indian reservations throughout the country and stuff. So, it's complex stuff, and I think sometimes when people see it in terms of sort of good or evil or heroes or villains, it can be a little bit more complicated than that at times. So I wanted to mention too, again, because sort of the complexities of everything. I know you may have seen my bust of Lincoln over my shoulder here, and so I want to talk a little bit about Lincoln's Indian policy, and we have to talk about the Dakota 38, the largest mass execution in American history that was ordered by President Lincoln. Now, this was a result of the Dakota War of 1862. It's also known as the Sioux Uprising, Dakota Uprising, Sioux Outbreak of 1862, Dakota Conflict, U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, and Little Crow's War. Now, it was a result of a series of treaties that had been signed in 1837, 1851, and 1858, basically swindling the Dakota peoples out of their land, and eventually all four bands of Dakota were made to move onto a reservation that was only 20 miles wide on both sides of the Minnesota River. There had been crop failure, there was a harsh winter, and so the wild game in the area had been depleted, and the Dakota were really kind of struggling for subsistence. Now, the government, was at this time encouraging the Dakota to give up their traditional ways of hunting and gathering and to become farmers and to engage in agriculture. This was, a common theme, and again, something we talked about in the context of the Wisconsin phalanx. So as a result of these hardships and the tensions between the Dakota and settlers that were moving into Minnesota, the Dakota started a rebellion. So on August 17th, 1862, 4 young Native men killed 5 white settlers in Action, Minnesota. A faction led by Chief Little Crow attacked the Lower Sioux Agency the next morning to drive all the settlers out of the Minnesota Valley. In weeks that followed, Dakota warriors attacked and killed hundreds of settlers and caused thousands to flee the area. And they took hundreds of mixed blood and white hostages, almost all of them women and children. So the government was slow to respond, but they eventually, were able to come in and crush the rebellion. It was during the Civil War, of course, so that's why the military response was slow. But eventually they did come in and stop the rebellion. By the end of the war, 358 settlers had been killed, as well as 77 soldiers and 29 militia. Number of Dakota casualties is unknown, but about 2,000 Dakota surrendered and were taken into custody. About 1,500 were non-combatants. So of the, roughly 2,000 that surrendered, many of them, non-combatants, they had convicted about 300 in a military tribunal. So in November 1862, the trials of the Dakota were held at Camp Release. Of the 40, so actually there were 498 trials held, but more than 300 men were sentenced to death for crimes ranging from rape to murder. The defendants were not allowed legal representation, and the trials themselves were brief, some lasting only 5 minutes. It was less than 6 weeks, and all these convictions were made. So President Abraham Lincoln did personally review the convictions of the men. He had people on both sides, proponents and opponents of execution, that were lobbying Lincoln on behalf of the settlers and on behalf of the Dakota. So in the end, Lincoln commuted about 90% of all the sentences. He commuted all but 39 sentences, deciding that the Dakota involved in civilian massacres should be executed. So on December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hung in Mankato, an event which remains the single largest execution in American history. So the men who received commuted sentence were sent to Camp McClellan in Iowa, where they would remain interned for 4 years, and then they were released. So there have been some myths about this, right? That they were hanged only for the crime of wanting to, or of stealing a cow to feed the village or whatever, things like that. It was a rebellion, and atrocities were certainly committed on both sides. Okay, so clearly the settlers were participants in the violence and bloodshed of it, and I would say certainly the Dakotas' rebellion was justified, and the government had swindled them out of land, much like they had done with the Seneca people, and that's why Lewis Henry Morgan was able to use his lawyer skills to actually get them some of their land back. So it is true about the Dakota 38 situation. Lincoln approved the execution of actually 39 Dakota men convicted by a military conviction of perpetrating massacres during the Dakota War of 1862. However, the military commission had sentenced 303 Dakota fighters to death, but Lincoln commuted 264, 90% of those sentences, despite threats of mob violence and intense pressure to reverse his decision. So although he did approve the 39 death sentences, it was 38 because one of the condemned men was ultimately spared. But he also prevented the hangings of 264 other Native Americans by commuting their death sentences in the same order. Sometimes the memification of this situation fails to make it clear that the death sentences didn't originate with Lincoln. They try to place all the blame on Lincoln, but the executions were ordered by a military commission and sent to the president, who had the legal authority to approve or decline the sentences. So again, was it a great thing? No, and I think the rebellion was justified. But there were women and children and children. There were rapes, so innocent people caught in the crossfire. So I'd say too, it's a lot more complex, than people like to think. So. I don't know. I mean, in the end, it was a war, and unfortunately, the Dakota lost. But they did, the rebellion was justified. But the Dakota did kidnap and in at least a few cases, definitely raped mixed race women and children, as well as whites too. It was also during the Civil War, and that's why the military response was slow. But things were really brutal on both sides during the Dakota War. So. Lincoln was trying to appease both sides by commuting the sentences of all those except the most brutal charges, even though the trials weren't fair. But Lincoln was known for his compassion. Lincoln was so known for his compassion, in fact, that Union generals usually wanted to execute soldiers who were guilty of insubordination or desertion quickly before the case reached Lincoln's desk, because it was known that Lincoln would usually pardon them. So, like I said, it was a difficult decision politically for him to make, to let so many Native Americans off after a violent uprising where almost 500 whites were killed. So another key factor in this was that Minnesota was at the center of the Free Soil debate leading into the war, and the 1st Minnesota Infantry was the first volunteer regiment to fight in the Civil War, and had action at a lot of the biggest battles early in the Civil War. So Lincoln couldn't afford to lose Minnesota's support. So I'm going to play a clip from the documentary The Dakota Conflict from 1993, another PBS-produced documentary that demonstrates, what I was just talking about. By the way, the documentary is directed by Christian Berg, and actually Garrison Keillor is one of the narrators.
The Dakota men were secured in a dark log prison in Mankato, a place they called Camp Lincoln. The president would be the one to sign the execution order. Abraham Lincoln asked if someone else could take this burden from him, but he was told he was the only one who could do it. The whites in Minnesota demanded that all should hang.
With the death toll reaching over 500 whites, the president was under tremendous pressure to approve the executions. Lincoln was reluctant. He assigned 2 clerks with the task of reviewing the trials of the 303 condemned Dakota. At first, Lincoln asked for them to list those guilty of molesting women, but when they found only 2, Lincoln had them look again, this time for those who killed civilians. The number rose to 38.
When he reported to the Senate, he said he wanted to act not with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak, but not with so much harshness as to be considered cruel. And so he compromised. And in doing that, he was reaching, I think, a political decision about what he could do under the circumstances.
So, for our final look at the relationship between early American socialists and the indigenous nations of North America that existed prior to colonization, we're going to look at the interfacing of religious communists with native spirits. So we talked last season about the Shakers. Last episode, we talked about the Ebenezer community, who later went on to form the Amana colonies. So we'll talk about Shakers' encounters with native spirits for a bit, and then we'll go on to kind of a strange and interesting story about witchcraft, ghosts, and the Seneca Nation, and the inspirationists at Ebenezer. So, as I was talking about before, with Lewis Henry Morgan, even before communitarian immigrants like the Shakers and the inspirationists came from Europe, the native peoples of upstate New York were living in a form of primary communism. And so, as I mentioned, Lewis Henry Morgan, who was based in Rochester, New York, was the first to identify the way of life of the indigenous Haudenosaunee people of Western New York as primitive communism. So the indigenous Haudenosaunee or Iroquois nation organized their society on a kinship-based form of socialism. So according to Morgan, the Iroquois practiced communism in living for centuries. And so groups like the Shakers saw the Haudenosaunee as fellow travelers. Throughout the early 19th century, Shakers had visions of native spirits. And while their possession rituals often amounted to what some today might consider racist stereotypes or melodramatic pageantry, they were remarkable as reflections of the Shakers' aspirations. They admired and wanted to live like native people. And so we're going to hear an excerpt from a piece by actually somebody that I'm studying under in my PhD work, Eric Seaman, who argues that native spirits offered Shakers a sense of group identity through collective responsibility for past injustices and the possibility of redemption by acknowledging such historical misdeeds. So they attempted to atone for the original American sin of settler colonialism by building a social order that they hoped was in harmony with that of the Iroquois. The Shakers were among the first white Americans to aspire to live up to the communitarian call of the Haudenosaunee region.
Native Spirits, Shaker Visions, Speaking with the Dead in the Early Republic. Author, Eric R. Seaman. Source, Journal of the Early Republic, Fall 2015, Volume 35, Number 3, Fall 2015, pages 347 to 373. In the early 1840s, hundreds of Shakers spoke with the spirits of dead Indians. The mostly youthful visionists danced and sang Indian songs. They carried around axes, dressed in skins, sat on the floor cross-legged, ate succotash. They hollered and chased one another from the meeting house. As Wampo, one of the native spirits, told a Shaker visionist, "Sometimes we can't help making great noise." This invasion of native spirits was not entirely a surprise. The United Society of Believers, as Shakers called themselves starting in 1826, had been communicating with dead Indians since the time of Mother and Lee. But during the Shaker revival known manifestations that had begun in 1837, interactions with native spirits were much more sustained and intense than they had ever been. For just over 6 months from September 1842 to March 1843, the 19 Shaker communities focused nearly all their spiritualistic energies on their native friends. Given the absurdity of some of the inspired Shakers' actions and the embarrassing faux pigeon visionists employed to represent Indian speech,
it has been easy to dismiss the Shakers' dalliance with native spirits as frivolous and, worse, racist. Observers at the time focused on the silliness of these spirit manifestations. Hervey Elkins, who spent 15 years as a Shaker, called the Indian behaviors truly ludicrous. To dismissals such as this, scholars have added the charge of racism. Catherine L. Albanese contends that racism was nowhere more revealed than in the American Indian spirits reported both by Shakers and seance spiritualists. In her view, the visionists played at Indianness in apparent and racist delight. And while many historians have noted the presence of native spirits during the era of manifestations, none have taken seriously the words attributed to the Indians. That is, none have analyzed native spirit narratives, the hundreds of pages of extant manuscript accounts of native spirit communications. The national context of Indian removal blended with the local context of religious enthusiasm when native spirits arrived in 1842. Mother Anne's work had been proceeding for about 5 years at this point. Indian spirits had occasionally visited the Shakers, but they had been outnumbered by more familiar residents of the afterlife. Upstate New York continued to earn its reputation as the burned-over district, with Finneyite revivalism now overtaken by the excitement and controversy generated by William Miller's belief that Christ was coming in 1843. As the Shakers, like the Millwrights, hoped for end times, the fervor of Mother Anne's work caused them to believe that the millennium was nigh. Indian spirits only added to that excitement, arriving in large numbers starting on September 3, 1842. On that day, a visionist named Miranda B. received a native spirit who, like many of the early spirits, showed the playful side of playing Indian. To personate the Indian chief, she engaged in a bit of cross-dressing and put on a brother's hat, a surtout, men's overcoat, and put a pipe in her mouth. In this period, dressing like an Indian did not mean putting on war paint and a plain-style headdress, a late 19th century version of playing Indian, but rather donning the garb of a more nondescript down-and-out person of color. Suitably attired, Miranda B. went out and seated herself in the dooryard on the ground, Indian fashion, went to the woodhouse and shouldered an axe, edge upwards and bravely walked about in the dooryard, and talked Indian a long time. The gender bending was unusual for native spirits. Squaws usually inhabited female visionists, whereas male visionists ordinarily spoke for Indians and chiefs. The next day, Aaron Haskins conformed to gender expectations and brought a message from an Indian chief who asked whether the 840 members of his tribe could attend the Shaker worship meeting. Permission, Rufus Bishop Drilley noted, was granted. Yet another group of Shakers had a wonderful noisy Indian meeting. 3 separate meetings of believers visited by native spirits in 2 days, surely this prefigured something important. Believers wanted to see themselves as shiny, as the native spirits called them, holy and even saintly figures. But they realized that they lived on formerly Indian lands and held racialized views about Indians. Native spirits provided a way to acknowledge the injustices of settler colonialism while giving the Shakers something they could do to make things better, bring the gospel to departed native spirits. This much can be seen in Father James's introduction to Mary Equimoa's native spirit narrative, as told by Eunice Bathrick. Father James was James Whitaker, a crucial figure in Shaker memory because he took over the group's leadership after Ann Lee died in 1784. From his perch in heaven, Father James translated Mary Equimoa's narrative so the Shakers of Harvard could understand it. He also wrote a brief introduction, outlining the story's purpose. As many of the more enlightened and civilized part of mankind have not entertained a very favorable opinion of their red brethren and sisters, Father James explains, and as this feeling has in some measure found its way into the hearts of mothers' children, he has brought Equimoa's story to Harvard. James's critique of Shaker attitudes toward Indians is delivered with a light touch. Only in some measure do they hold unfavorable opinions of Indians, but nonetheless he asserts that the believers have something to learn from Mary Equimoa. Her story will be for the use and benefit of mothers' children, so that they may learn from her example true humility and resignation. This builds on centuries of representations of Christian Indian deathbed scenes, from which pious Euro-Americans learned values such as resignation to God's will as they shed a tear for the fate of poor Indians. Many antebellum Americans desperately wanted to learn more about heaven. The Shakers took that desire to its logical end and held frequent conversations with residents of the spirit world. During the 1830s, an era of heightened religious passions for many Americans, the Shakers likewise experienced increasingly intense religious manifestations, especially in their more frequent communications with the dead. We will never know with certainty why. 5 years into the Shaker revival, occasional visits from native spirits turned into a veritable flood, which then receded after 6 months. Whether the visits were triggered by the era of removal and the Second Seminole War is impossible to say, though references to Osceola and the broader discourse about vanishing Indians indicate that the manifestations did not occur in a vacuum. Against this backdrop, the native spirit narratives offer some surprising insights. Perhaps because Shaker visionists attempted, consciously or subconsciously, to put themselves in the position of the natives whose words they reported, believers expressed ideas about Indians that were more complex than those found in many other sources from the 1840s. In addition to stereotypical descriptions of native savagery and ignorance, one finds attempts to wrestle with the legacy of settler colonialism and land dispossession. Building on 2 centuries of Anglo-American missionary writings about Indians, the Shakers indulged sentimental ideas about vanishing, indeed vanished, Indians. Moreover, some female believers reported messages from native spirits that resonated with contemporary discussions of the male propensity toward violence. The Shakers were indeed playing Indian in the 1840s, and much in their Indian performance was playful and even silly, but that should not obscure the serious messages underneath the talk of moccasins and succotash. Only 5 years after the natives departed from Shaker villages, communication with the spirit world by residents of upstate New York once again commanded widespread attention. In 1848, Kate and Margaret Fox of Hydesville, some 30 miles east of Rochester, claimed the ability to communicate with a ghost by interpreting its rappings. After the Fox sisters demonstrated their ability to speak with the dead in New York City, seance spiritualism exploded in popularity across the country. At the time, some Shakers took credit for this movement, arguing that their own lively exchanges with the dead during Mother Ann's work paved the way for the broader acceptance of spiritualism. But these Shakers may have confused cause and effect. The thousands of worldlings who watched believers speak with the dead during the era of manifestations indicated their interest in spirit communication by their very attendance at Shaker public worship. In other words, Shaker interactions with native spirits and seance spiritualism both emerged from the deeply rooted Anglo-American desire to communicate with the dead.
Okay, now we'll finish up by talking about the Ebenezer Society, a group of German pietists that we talked about in the German American History episode, who took over the Seneca Buffalo Creek Reservation and had some dealings with the Seneca. Luckily for them, the Captain Watcher of the New York was actually really quite nice to them, and he introduced the elders to a land agent and translator named Mr. Paulson, who worked for the Ogden Land Company. Mr. Paulson then referred them to agents in Western New York, who took them to look at the Buffalo Creek Reservation and also another property near Lake Chautauqua. The elders found Buffalo Creek very attractive. There was plenty of timber and an Indian-built sawmill and other Indian improvements on the reservation there. They dealt with Thomas Ogden. Now, this is a picture of David Ogden, and their initial offer had been too low, so Thomas Ogden refused. Then they made another offer. Metz had been quite disheartened when Ogden refused their initial offer, but then they offered $41,000. So today that would be $1.6 million in graduated payments for the property. The first $3,000 of the payments was to pay off the Seneca Indian land claims. Now, this was a bit of deception on the part of the Ogden Land Company because, as we will talk about in a minute, as a result of the Second Treaty of Buffalo Creek, if 9/10 of the Seneca refused to sell their land, the contract would be null and void. And so, the inspirationists, I guess, would have had to go back to Germany, which would have been extremely difficult at the time when they were beginning settlement. So, as I said, in 1838, the Second Treaty of Buffalo Creek was made between the government and the Seneca. The rationale was that the Seneca wanted to move to Wisconsin to be with their friends, the Menominee, but Quakers who had intervened on behalf of the Native Americans said, no, this was not true. And in the Quaker report, it said, runners were hired to scour the forest and bring in every chief who could be prevailed upon by means fair or foul to sign the assent. So they used liquor, lies, and threats, and eventually only 16 out of the 81 Seneca chiefs assented to the treaty. Now, the third treaty of Buffalo Creek was known as the Compromise Treaty, and this was meant to kind of fix the problems with the previous one. This was made in 1842, and so it returned the Allegheny and Cattaraugus reservations to the Seneca, but compelled them to sell off the Buffalo Creek and Tonawanda reservations. If the remaining Indians refused to sell, then the Ogden Land Company had no legal right to evict them. And also, they had no legal right to give a deed until all the Seneca land claims were bought off. So, the Inspirationists had paid all this money to the Ogden Land Company, who had no real legal right to even give them a deed to the property. The Inspirationists made a peace treaty with the Seneca Indians, which expired in May 1842. And the Seneca then took the Inspirationists to court in order to move for eviction proceedings against them. So in court, the Inspirationists had to deal with the government and with the Seneca Indians. They tried to get the Ogden Land Company to pay off the Seneca. Ogden was supposed to pay $70,000, which the Inspirationists had already paid to them, for the deed from the government, which was to go to the Indians, but they refused. Metz said of Thomas Ogden, "He is so hard-hearted, we stand between the company and the Indians." Eventually, actually, Millard Fillmore, future president, at the time Buffalo lawyer, wrote an opinion in favor of the Inspirationists to the court. And actually, on June 18th, 1844, a judge did rule in favor of the Inspirationists, as you know, they had already started settlement and didn't really have anywhere else to go.
This is where the cabin of Calcutta was, and this was a famous case. Actually, there's a book called Seneca Spirits about witchcraft. It talks about this landmark case. Tommy Jemmy was a Seneca chief that executed Calcutta for witchcraft, and according to legend, the Ebenezers, they settled some of the Indian-built cabins on the Buffalo Creek Reservation, and according to legend, a few of the Ebenezer Inspirationists saw a ghost of the witch Calcutta, and asked Christian Metz if they could move to a different cabin. I wasn't able to find any information on that in my research in Christian Metz's diary or in Gottlieb Schooner's history, but it is sort of a local legend, and so that's why, you know, there's the marker for folklore and legends here. Now, here is the actual Ebenezer Cemetery section of the Lower Ebenezer Cemetery, and as you can see, it does have the names marked here, but there are not any marked graves in this section. And then actually back here somewhere is where the Calcutta's cabin was said to be. All right, so here we are at the edge of the Buffalo Creek at the site of the Christian Metz home. You can see an old mill. Actually, maybe you can barely see the rooftop over there, but that was also an Ebenezer building. Let's go up to the front of the building here. There's one of the original millstones from the Ebenezer Mill. And here's the Christian Metz house. As I said, a lot of the Inspirationists moved into cabins that already existed on the Buffalo Creek Reservation that were built by Indians. So initially, Metz did live in a cabin built by Indians. But so this is his home here. These are also Ebenezer buildings on the rest of this street here too as well. So Christian Metz lived here. This building was erected in 1840. It was the home of George Stanner, operator of the Indian sawmill. And then later, Christian Metz, leader of the Ebenezer Society, occupied this house.
Made from a
up in the joint, huh? Stealing my light, huh? Watch me, dude, watch me. Yo, check these up top murderers. Snowy in the bezel as the cloud merges. FBI trying, won't word with this. Kid who booted down, bust a shot up in the beacon. Catch me in the corner, not speaking. Crushed out heavenly. Eugene rock the sweet daddy long frock means. Chicken and broccoli, Wally's look stink. You and his man straight from Raleigh dog. He recognized Kojak. I slapped the five master killer, cracked his tiny form. Everybody break bread, huddle around, guzzle that. I'm about to throw hair in your bag. Since the face been revealed, game got real. Radio been gassing niggas, my imposters. Scream the ill, I'm the inventor. 86 rhyming at the center debut. 93 LP, told you to enter pump. You're stealing my light. Crawl up in the bed with grandma beneath the lazy boy where you hit your knife. Ghost is back, stretch Cadillacs, fruit cocktails, hit the shells at Pulse pastry rag. Walk with me, light dark, they try to judge these plus degrees. Sessacal, Rastafari, getting waxed all through the drive-thru. Take the stand, throw my hand on the Bible, and tell lies too. I'm the ultimate. Splash the Wolverine, razor star ring, Dolomit. Student and roll hole in it. Hey yo, this rap is like ZD, facing me real TV. Crescent high speed, strawberry kiwi. As we approach your hood, the guards bill. This that now the ferry boat cast bill. Fresh Sally's 50 deep up in the city. We been for life. Apollo kids live to spit the real. A pair of bright fat yellow Air Max. Hit the rack, snatch a must, son. $20 off, no tax. Dream merchant, tucked in the clouds, stay splurging. Rock an eagle head, 6-inch height. What the bird? Monday night, Dallas verse Jets. 2 split in with 1 hand. 2 culture ciphers, 1 bag of wet. Heavy rain, fuck my kicks up. Wasn't looking splash in the puddle. Big slap, and first thought was beat the bitch up. Moseyed off gracefully, New York's most wanted Chiba Hawk. See the yellow brick roll, let's throw the pastries. Saint Ghostface, holy in the mind. Last seen Manhattan Chase, we drew the 6-8 digit in the briefcase. Rawness, title is hellbound. Quick to reload around, faces surround, look us down. We spit a fair one, poker nose money, gin rummy with glare. Spot the lame bit his ear. Yo, taste a teaspoon, 300 goons, stash balloons, locked in lab rooms, hit with the Glock, stashed in Grand Store, glocked him like a patient. His stocks for hustle invasion, knowing how we got the block off. The chain tricolor, freezing and below, icicle galore. Gas station light gleaming on the wall. Cop wise, got James Bond bands, niggas flip jams, rock boats underwater, watch clams. Pose for the standoff, man timid, hoping that the gun fall, guessing like lottery balls, yo. Hey, yo, this rap is like ZD,